Warren Buffett has never been a man drawn to political theatrics. For more than 6 decades, the Oracle of Omaha built his reputation on one simple belief: American stability is the safest long-term investment on earth. He avoided partisan battles, refused to be pulled into culture wars, and consistently treated democracy as the quiet, reliable background condition that made prosperity possible. That is precisely why what happened this week has sent shockwaves through Washington, Wall Street, and global capitals alike. Buffett broke his long-standing political silence and issued a warning that many are still struggling to fully process. Speaking publicly, he said that American democracy is facing its most severe institutional test since the Civil War, and that if the Senate fails to take constitutional enforcement seriously in the coming emergency session, the entire system of checks and balances could collapse within a single generation. Those were not the words of a partisan activist or a cable news provocateur. They came from someone whose wealth and world view were built on the assumption that American institutions ultimately hold. This moment is not simply about Donald Trump facing yet another political or legal confrontation. That framing misses the deeper issue entirely. What is unfolding right now strikes at the core question of whether the United States still operates under a system where the law constrains presidential power, or whether it has drifted into an era where political loyalty overrides constitutional duty. The emergency session scheduled in the Senate is not a symbolic gesture or a routine procedural dispute. It is a direct test of whether the legislative branch is still willing to act as a co-equal check on executive authority. The consequences of that decision will not fade after the next election cycle. They will define the structure of American governance for decades to come. Behind the scenes, events have been moving at a pace and intensity that most Americans remain largely unaware of. Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer announced that the chamber will convene for emergency proceedings that legal scholars are already describing as unprecedented in modern American history. This is not an impeachment replay, and it is not a standard political investigation. It is a constitutional enforcement process triggered by a federal criminal conviction that carries mandatory Senate review. The mechanism itself has not been seriously used since the Reconstruction era, when Congress confronted the aftermath of rebellion and insurrection. From the moment the conviction was handed down 3 weeks ago, Schumer began navigating a procedural maze that few living lawmakers have ever encountered. He consulted extensively with the Senate parliamentarian, examined historical records dating back to 1868, and engaged constitutional scholars across the ideological spectrum. Questions that had long existed only in loss, cool hypotheticals, suddenly became urgent matters of state. What quorum rules apply, whether the Chief Justice must preside, and whether a two-thirds vote is required under these unique circumstances. As this process unfolded, the country quietly slipped into a constitutional gray zone. Federal agencies began operating without clear certainty about whether presidential directives carried unquestioned legal authority. International allies started asking private but pointed questions about the reliability of American treaty commitments, if the individual issuing them might be constitutionally disqualified from office. Inside the Justice Department, attorneys filed motions in dozens of cases raising an issue almost unthinkable in normal times: whether the United States government itself had legitimate representation before the courts. This paralysis did not arise from a single dramatic moment, but from prolonged Senate inaction as Republicans and Democrats remained deadlocked over whether a criminally convicted president can continue exercising power while appeals are pending. At the center of this standoff sits Mitch McConnell, a figure long defined by his self-image as an institutional guardian. For years, McConnell styled himself as the defender of Senate tradition, the master of parliamentary procedure, and the steady hand guiding the chamber through turbulent political waters. Yet this crisis has exposed the limits of that identity. Donald Trump has made it unmistakably clear that he has little interest in constitutional deliberation or institutional process. His demand is total loyalty, unconditional protection, and a Senate willing to behave as if a federal criminal conviction is politically inconvenient rather than legally consequential. The idea that senators might actually fulfill their constitutional obligations is, in Trump's framing, not principled governance but betrayal. The irony is that the Constitution itself explicitly anticipates scenarios like this. The 14th Amendment was not written as ornamental language. It was designed in the aftermath of national trauma to prevent individuals who violate their oath to the Constitution from holding federal office. Its disqualification provisions exist precisely to address situations where ordinary political mechanisms fail to contain anti-democratic conduct. Yet invoking those provisions now has triggered fury rather than reflection among Trump's allies. When McConnell initially suggested that the Senate should follow a deliberative constitutional process, Trump reacted with open hostility. He publicly accused McConnell of betrayal, labeling any senator who refused to immediately dismiss the proceedings as a traitor aligned with shadowy forces. These were not the record remarks or private pressure campaigns. Trump broadcast his anger in the early hours of the morning, making clear that constitutional duty would not be tolerated if it conflicted with personal allegiance. That outburst sent a chill through Republican ranks. If Trump was willing to attack the party's most experienced Senate tactician for merely acknowledging constitutional responsibility, what did that mean for everyone else? The message was unmistakable. Loyalty to Trump supersedes loyalty to the Constitution, and deviation will be punished. This pattern is not new, but its stakes have never been higher. Over the years, Trump has repeatedly turned on allies the moment they adhered to legal or ethical constraints. Jeff Sessions, Bill Barr, Mike Pence, and Kevin McCarthy all learned the same lesson in different ways. Service, devotion, and public defense offer no lasting protection once constitutional obligations enter the picture. As the crisis deepened into its third week, public frustration began to surface. Polling showed a growing majority of Americans, including a substantial portion of Republicans, believe the Senate has an obligation to address criminal convictions rather than ignore them. This shift threatened Trump's carefully cultivated image of dominance and inevitability. He thrives on projecting strength and control, not on being subjected to sober institutional scrutiny. The prospect of a Senate process that treats him as accountable under the law is fundamentally incompatible with that image. It was at this point that his opposition hardened, transforming from rhetorical pressure into an all-out campaign to delegitimize the proceedings themselves. This is the environment in which Warren Buffett chose to speak. His warning was not about partisan advantage or electoral strategy. It was about the long-term viability of a system that depends on leaders choosing constitutional duty over personal power. When someone whose life's work rests on faith in American institutions says that faith is in jeopardy, it deserves serious attention, the emergency session now looming is more than a political event. It is a moment of institutional truth, one that will reveal whether the Senate still sees itself as a constitutional body or merely as a shield for partisan survival. As the emergency proceedings drew closer, the internal fractures within the Senate became impossible to hide. What had once been quiet disagreements over strategy hardened into open ideological conflict about the very nature of constitutional responsibility. Republican senators found themselves pulled in opposite directions, caught between an electorate still heavily influenced by Trump and a constitutional framework that does not bend easily to personal loyalty. This tension transformed routine caucus meetings into tense strategic battles, where every word was weighed for how it might be interpreted by Trump's base, conservative legal elites, and an increasingly frustrated public. Mitch McConnell's predicament worsened by the day. For decades, he had positioned himself as a defender of Senate norms, someone who understood that institutions survive only when their rules are respected, even under political pressure. Yet now, those very instincts placed him at odds with the dominant force in his party. McConnell's public acknowledgment of the conviction and his refusal to prejudge the proceedings were, by any historical standard, minimal gestures toward due process. He did not endorse disqualification, nor did he signal an intent to side with Democrats. He merely suggested that evidence should be reviewed and constitutional questions addressed seriously. In a functioning democracy, that position would hardly be controversial. In this moment, it was treated as heresy. Trump's response was swift and ferocious. To him, procedure itself became the enemy. The idea that senators might consult the parliamentarian, hear expert testimony, or examine the 14th Amendment's disqualification provisions was framed as an act of sabotage. His legal team escalated the pressure, circulating a lengthy letter to Republican senators asserting that the Senate had no authority to act at all. According to that argument, judicial findings could simply be ignored, constitutional oversight dismissed as illegitimate, and separation of powers invoked selectively to shield the executive from accountability. McConnell was singled out by name, accused of abandoning conservative principles by even entertaining the notion of Senate review. This maneuver placed Republican senators in an impossible bind. On one side stood Trump, still commanding intense loyalty from the party base and threatening political annihilation for dissenters. On the other stood conservative legal thinkers, institutionalists, and donors who care deeply about constitutional governance. Organizations like the Federalist Society and scholars affiliated with respected conservative institutions were watching closely. Their concern was not whether Trump would prevail politically, but whether the Senate would effectively declare that constitutional text applies only when convenient. Ignoring a federal judge's certification of constitutional violations would signal that the Senate no longer views itself as bound by the Constitution in moments of political discomfort. As these pressures mounted, visible cracks began to form. Moderate Republicans expressed unease, signaling that they intended to approach the proceedings with an open mind. That alone was enough to trigger Trump's wrath. Public attacks followed, complete with promises to support primary challengers and accusations of betrayal. Senators who had carefully navigated Trump's dominance for years suddenly found themselves exposed. The implicit bargain that had governed Republican politics since 2016, that loyalty would be rewarded with protection, was collapsing under the weight of constitutional reality. The internal conflict intensified when members of the Trump-aligned faction broke from McConnell's measured approach altogether. Calls emerged to dismiss the proceedings outright, without evidence, review, or debate. This was not merely a tactical disagreement. It represented a fundamentally different view of governance. Under this logic, the Senate's role was not to deliberate or check executive power, but to neutralize any threat to Trump's authority. A group of Republican senators circulated a letter demanding immediate dismissal, arguing that even acknowledging constitutional questions lent legitimacy to what they described as a partisan attack. The spectacle of senators urging the chamber to abandon deliberation underscored how far the institution had drifted from its traditional self-conception. While the Senate struggled internally, the legal foundation of the crisis became clearer. The catalyst for the emergency proceedings was an extraordinary action by the federal judiciary. The U.S. District Court for the District of Columbia issued a criminal conviction on multiple felony counts tied to election interference. More significantly, the judge took the rare step of formally certifying to the Senate that the convictions raised constitutional questions under the 14th Amendment requiring legislative review. This certification was not advisory language or rhetorical flourish. It was a direct invocation of the Senate's constitutional responsibility. The judge's ruling left little room for ambiguity. The conduct in question was described as a deliberate attempt to subvert the constitutional transfer of power, striking at the core of democratic governance. The certification emphasized that the judiciary cannot unilaterally determine eligibility for federal office under the disqualification clause. That responsibility belongs to the political branches, with the Senate playing a central role. In effect, the court handed the issue to Congress and said plainly, "This is now your duty." Legal experts across the ideological spectrum recognized the gravity of this move. The certification mechanism had not been meaningfully used in more than a century and a half. Its revival signaled that the judiciary viewed the situation not as routine criminal accountability, but as a systemic constitutional threat. Conservative commentators, including former federal prosecutors, acknowledged that ignoring such a certification would push the country into uncharted constitutional territory. When voices typically aligned with Republican administrations warned that refusing to act would represent a breakdown in separation of powers, the seriousness of the moment became undeniable. The Senate's response, or lack thereof, began to ripple outward. Courts questioned whether executive branch filings carried full legitimacy. Foreign governments quietly reassessed the reliability of American commitments. Investors and business leaders, accustomed to institutional predictability, started factoring political instability into long-term calculations. This was the context in which Warren Buffett's warning resonated so powerfully. He was not reacting to a single ruling or speech, but to the cumulative erosion of norms that underpin confidence in American governance. The deeper issue now confronting the Senate is whether it still accepts the premise that no individual, including a president, is above the law. The Constitution's design assumes that ambition will counteract ambition, that institutions will check one another, even when doing so is politically costly. That assumption is being tested in real time. If senators choose partisan protection over constitutional enforcement, they will not merely resolve a single crisis, they will redefine the presidency itself. The consequences of such a choice extend far beyond Trump. They establish a precedent that future presidents will exploit. If criminal convictions tied to election subversion can be brushed aside, then the deterrent effect of law collapses. Power becomes self-justifying, constrained only by party loyalty rather than legal principle. That is the scenario Buffett warned about, a gradual but profound transformation of American democracy into something unrecognizable from its constitutional origins. As the emergency session approaches, the Senate stands at a crossroads. The path of least resistance is clear and politically tempting. It avoids immediate backlash from Trump and his supporters, but it comes at the cost of institutional credibility and constitutional integrity. The harder path demands that senators act as constitutional officers rather than political operatives, accepting short-term political pain to preserve long-term democratic stability. History will remember which choice they make. As the emergency session loomed, the broader consequences of Senate paralysis became impossible to ignore. What had initially appeared to many Americans as yet another Washington standoff was now revealing itself as a full-scale institutional breakdown. The longer the Senate delayed meaningful action, the more visible the damage became. This was no longer confined to political punditry or legal theory. It was affecting how government functioned on a daily basis, how courts interpreted executive authority, and how the rest of the world assessed the reliability of the United States as a constitutional democracy. Inside federal agencies, uncertainty seeped into decision-making at every level. Senior officials quietly questioned whether presidential directives would withstand legal scrutiny if the individual issuing them was ultimately deemed constitutionally ineligible. Career civil servants, trained to follow lawful orders rather than political commands, found themselves navigating a dangerous gray zone. Acting too decisively risked future legal exposure, hesitating risked accusations of insubordination. This hesitation slowed regulatory actions, stalled enforcement decisions, and injected doubt into areas of governance that normally operate with quiet efficiency. The machinery of government does not collapse all at once. It grinds down gradually as confidence erodes. The Justice Department felt the strain most acutely. In courtrooms across the country, government attorneys faced skeptical judges asking questions that would have been unthinkable just months earlier. Who exactly are you representing, and under what authority? Does the executive branch currently possess undisputed constitutional legitimacy? These were not hostile interrogations driven by ideology, but sober inquiries rooted in judicial responsibility. When the legitimacy of executive power is in question, courts cannot simply assume it away. Each unresolved day compounded the problem, creating inconsistent rulings and weakening the government's position in active litigation. Internationally, the situation was even more alarming. Allies who depend on American leadership and treaty commitments began reassessing risk. Diplomats spoke in guarded language, careful not to inflame tensions, but the concern was unmistakable. If constitutional uncertainty undermines the authority of the presidency, then agreements signed today could be challenged tomorrow. In global politics, credibility is currency, and uncertainty devalues it quickly. Adversaries, meanwhile, watched closely, recognizing opportunity in American disarray. A nation preoccupied with internal constitutional conflict is less capable of projecting stability abroad. Public opinion began shifting in response to these visible disruptions. Polls showed growing frustration not only with Trump's legal troubles, but with the Senate's apparent inability to address them. Americans may disagree sharply on politics, but there remains broad support for the principle that laws should apply equally. As the crisis dragged on, more voters concluded that ignoring criminal convictions for political convenience crossed a line. This shift mattered because it threatened the core narrative Trump relies on, that his battles are merely partisan attacks divorced from public concern. The data suggested otherwise. This changing landscape intensified Trump's reaction. He has always understood the power of narrative, and the prospect of being framed not as a victim but as a constitutional liability alarmed him. His public rhetoric grew more aggressive, casting the Senate process itself as illegitimate and dangerous. He portrayed any acknowledgement of constitutional oversight as an attack on democracy rather than a defense of it. This inversion was strategic. By redefining accountability as persecution, he sought to rally supporters against the very institutions designed to constrain executive abuse. Yet this strategy carried risks for Republican lawmakers. The more Trump attacked constitutional mechanisms, the harder it became for senators to justify silence without appearing complicit. Conservative legal scholars, some of whom had previously defended Trump on other grounds, began drawing firmer lines. They emphasized that the 14th Amendment's disqualification clause was not optional or symbolic. It was written in response to a historical crisis, precisely to prevent individuals who undermine constitutional order from returning to power. Treating it as irrelevant would effectively nullify a core safeguard of the post-Civil War constitutional framework. The Senate's dilemma now extended beyond Trump himself. Its response would signal whether constitutional enforcement depends on partisan alignment. If accountability applies only when politically convenient, then constitutional law becomes a tool of power rather than a constraint on it. That realization alarmed institutionalists across the spectrum. Even senators inclined to protect Trump politically began to worry about the long-term consequences of setting such a precedent. Once established, it would not be easily undone, and it would not remain confined to one individual. This is where the comparison to earlier moments in American history became unavoidable. The last time Congress confronted questions of constitutional eligibility on this scale was during Reconstruction, when lawmakers grappled with how to reintegrate a nation fractured by rebellion. The mechanisms developed then were designed to prevent a return to instability by ensuring that those who betrayed constitutional principles could not simply resume power as if nothing had happened. Reviving those mechanisms now underscored how severe the current crisis had become. Democracies do not reach for century-old safeguards lightly. Warren Buffett's intervention added a different dimension to the debate. His warning resonated not because of its rhetoric, but because of its implications. Investors, business leaders, and economists understand that political systems underpin markets. Stability, predictability, and the rule of law are not abstract ideals. They are prerequisites for long-term economic confidence. When Buffett suggested that constitutional collapse was a real possibility, he was signaling that the risk had moved from theoretical to tangible. That message reverberated far beyond political circles. Within the Senate, the pressure intensified daily. McConnell's attempt to balance institutional responsibility with party unity grew increasingly untenable. Each concession to Trump's demands weakened the Senate's standing as an independent branch. Each move toward constitutional enforcement risked political retaliation. The middle ground narrowed until it was nearly non-existent. At some point, delay itself became a decision, one that favored executive impunity by default. The broader public began to sense the stakes more clearly. Media coverage shifted from episodic reporting to sustained focus on constitutional implications. Legal experts explained in plain terms what was at risk: a future in which presidents could commit serious offenses related to elections and governance without fear of disqualification, provided their party remained loyal. That prospect unsettled voters who may not follow constitutional law closely but understand instinctively that unchecked power is dangerous. As the opening gavel of the emergency session approached, the atmosphere grew heavy with expectation. This was no longer about managing optics or winning news cycles. It was about defining the boundaries of presidential authority in the modern era. Would the Senate affirm that constitutional limits still matter, even when politically inconvenient? Or would it signal that power, once obtained, can shield itself from accountability? The answer will echo far beyond the chamber's walls. It will shape how future presidents view their authority, how courts assess executive legitimacy, and how citizens understand the relationship between law and power. Moments like this do not announce themselves as historical turning points until long after they pass. But all the signs are here. The Senate is standing at the edge of a decision that will either reinforce the foundations of constitutional democracy or accelerate their erosion. As the emergency session finally came into view, the illusion that this was merely a procedural dispute collapsed completely. What senators now faced was a defining test of character, one that would expose whether constitutional governance in the United States still functions as intended or has quietly given way to raw political survival. The pressure was no longer abstract. It was personal, immediate, and impossible to evade. Every senator understood that whatever choice they made would follow them for the rest of their careers and likely beyond. Inside the Senate chamber, preparation meetings took on an unusually grave tone. Staffers, lawyers, and policy advisors worked around the clock, not to craft talking points, but to anticipate institutional consequences. Questions circulated that went far beyond Trump himself. If the Senate refused to engage with the judicial certification, would that effectively neuter the 14th Amendment? If criminal convictions tied to election subversion could be dismissed as irrelevant, what incentive would future presidents have to respect constitutional limits? These were not questions with comfortable answers, and avoiding them only made them more dangerous. The Senate's credibility was now fully on the line. For generations, it had been described as the world's greatest deliberative body, a place where passions cool and constitutional reasoning prevails. That reputation had already taken damage over years of escalating partisanship, but this moment threatened something deeper. Ignoring a federal judge's explicit call for constitutional review would signal that the Senate no longer recognizes binding obligations beyond party interest. That would transform it from a co-equal branch into a political shield, protecting power rather than regulating it. Trump's strategy throughout this period remained consistent. He framed every constitutional mechanism as an act of persecution and every call for accountability as proof of corruption. This approach has always relied on blurring distinctions between law and politics, persuading supporters that any legal consequence is inherently illegitimate. In doing so, he effectively asks his allies to reject the premise that institutions can act independently of partisan intent. For senators who accept this framing, constitutional law becomes optional, something to be invoked only when it aligns with immediate political goals. Yet that framing began to fracture under sustained scrutiny. Legal scholars, including conservatives who had supported Trump in the past, publicly emphasized that the 14th Amendment is not discretionary. Its disqualification language was designed precisely to operate when ordinary political processes fail. The amendment assumes that there will be moments when loyalty to individuals conflicts with loyalty to the constitutional order. In those moments, it demands that institutions choose the latter. Treating this obligation as a partisan attack undermines the amendment's very purpose. Public trust hung in the balance. Polls consistently showed that Americans expect accountability for serious offenses, regardless of political affiliation. While Trump's core supporters remained unmoved, a broader segment of voters watched the Senate closely, interpreting its actions as a signal of whether democratic norms still hold. Every delay, every attempt to minimize the issue, reinforced the perception that political elites operate under a different set of rules. That perception is corrosive. Democracies do not fail only through coups or revolutions. They fail when citizens stop believing that institutions serve the common good. The economic implications added another layer of urgency. Markets thrive on predictability, and constitutional uncertainty is the opposite of predictable. Investors and corporate leaders began voicing concerns privately, wary of a political environment where legal outcomes depend on party alignment rather than established rules. Warren Buffett's warning crystallized those fears. When someone so deeply invested in American stability signals alarm, it suggests that the risk is no longer hypothetical. Institutional decay carries economic costs that accumulate quietly but relentlessly. Within the Republican caucus, the fear of retaliation remained intense. Trump's influence over primaries and party infrastructure gave him leverage unmatched by any recent political figure. Senators understood that crossing him could end their careers. But they also understood that compliance came with its own cost. Protecting Trump at the expense of constitutional enforcement would tether the party's future to his legal and ethical vulnerabilities. It would also signal to future leaders that loyalty, not legality, is the currency of power. The gravity of the choice sharpened as comparisons to other democracies emerge. Around the world, systems that once appeared stable have eroded when leaders undermined judicial independence and legislative oversight. In many cases, the erosion began not with dramatic power grabs, but with rationalizations. Each exception was justified as temporary, each compromise framed as necessary. Over time, those exceptions accumulated, hollowing out democratic institutions from within. The United States now faced a similar inflection point, one masked by familiarity but no less consequential. As senators prepared to take their seats, the symbolism of the moment became unavoidable. The chamber itself, steeped in history, has witnessed wars, impeachments, and national crises. Yet rarely has it confronted a challenge so directly tied to the survival of constitutional limits on executive power. This was not about policy differences or ideological disputes. It was about whether the system still enforces boundaries on those who seek to rule it. Trump's calculation was clear. If the Senate declined to act meaningfully, it would validate his belief that power, once secured, can override law. It would embolden future efforts to test constitutional limits, knowing that political loyalty offers protection. If the Senate did act even partially, it would reaffirm that no individual stands above the Constitution. That outcome would not end political conflict, but it would preserve the principle that law remains supreme. For McConnell and others like him, The decision carried personal and institutional consequences. Choosing constitutional enforcement risked immediate backlash and long-term political damage. Choosing inaction risked something far greater, the transformation of the Senate into a body that exists to defend power rather than constrain it. History tends to judge harshly those who prioritize short-term survival over long-term integrity, especially when the stakes involve democratic governance itself. As the emergency session began, one truth became inescapable. This was not a moment that could be spun away or forgotten. The record of how senators acted, what arguments they made, and which principles they upheld would endure. Long after individual careers ended, the precedent set here would continue shaping American political life. The choice before the Senate was stark. Either reaffirm that constitutional duty transcends party allegiance, or accept a future where presidential authority operates with few meaningful limits. That choice will determine not just the fate of one man or one election, but the resilience of the American constitutional system itself. As the emergency proceedings unfold, the United States finds itself staring into a mirror it has long avoided. This moment is no longer about personalities, poll numbers, or short-term political victories. It is about whether the American constitutional system still possesses the internal strength to restrain power when restraint is most inconvenient. The decisions made now will not fade with headlines or election cycles. They will harden into precedent, shaping how power is exercised, challenged, and justified for generations. At the center of everything lies a simple but uncomfortable question: do laws still apply to presidents in a meaningful way? The Constitution was designed around the assumption that ambition would inevitably clash with ambition, that no single individual could be trusted with unchecked authority. That is why power was fragmented, why Congress was given oversight responsibilities, and why later amendments explicitly closed loopholes exposed by national trauma. The 14th Amendment stands as one of the clearest examples of that corrective impulse. It was written by lawmakers who had learned, through painful experience, that democracy cannot survive if those who attack it are allowed to reclaim power without consequence. What makes this moment so dangerous is not just Trump's behavior, but the willingness of political actors to rationalize it. Each argument for inaction sounds, on its own, reasonable enough. Let the courts handle it. Let voters decide, avoid inflaming tensions, preserve party unity, yet taken together, these justifications amount to a quiet surrender of constitutional responsibility. They shift accountability away from institutions specifically designed to enforce it. Over time, that shift becomes normalization. What once seemed unthinkable begins to feel routine. This is precisely how democratic erosion occurs. It rarely arrives through dramatic declarations or sudden coups. Instead, it advances through incremental retreats, each framed as temporary or pragmatic. Institutions defer action to avoid conflict, leaders test boundaries to see how much resistance they face, and gradually the balance of power tilts. By the time the danger is obvious to everyone, the mechanisms meant to stop it have already weakened. The emergency session represents a rare interruption of that pattern. It forces senators to confront their role directly. They cannot plausibly claim ignorance, nor can they hide behind procedural ambiguity. A federal judge has issued a criminal conviction and explicitly certified constitutional questions to the Senate. Legal experts across ideological lines have emphasized that this creates an obligation, not an option. In this context, choosing not to act is itself a substantive decision, one that carries constitutional meaning. The political consequences of action or inaction are obvious, but they are not the most important ones. Far more significant is the signal sent to future presidents. If this moment ends with the Senate declining to engage seriously, it tells every ambitious leader that constitutional limits are negotiable. It tells them that loyalty can override legality, that party control can neutralize oversight, and that even the most serious offenses related to democratic governance can be weathered with enough political pressure. That lesson will not be forgotten. Conversely, if the Senate asserts its role, even imperfectly, it reinforces a critical principle that the Constitution is not a suggestion, and that power does not place one above the law. Such an outcome would not resolve all divisions or end political conflict, but it would preserve the architecture that allows those conflicts to unfold within lawful boundaries rather than raw power struggles. Democracies survive not because they avoid crises, but because their institutions respond to crises with integrity. This is why Warren Buffett's warning matters so much. He is not invested in partisan outcomes. His concern lies with institutional durability. Markets, businesses, and societies depend on predictable rules. When constitutional enforcement becomes optional, uncertainty spreads, investment hesitates. Trust erodes, stability, once taken for granted, becomes fragile. Buffett's intervention was a signal that the costs of failure here extend far beyond politics. They touch the foundations of economic and social confidence. Looking ahead, the implications for the 2024 elections are significant but secondary. Voters will interpret the Senate's actions as a reflection of broader values. A system perceived as unwilling to hold leaders accountable risks alienating moderates, independents, and even principled conservatives. At the same time, the normalization of impunity energizes those who believe power should be unconstrained. The resulting polarization is not just political, it is structural, dividing citizens over whether law itself still matters. The Senate's choice will also shape its own legacy. Institutions are remembered not for their rhetoric, but for how they act under pressure. Future generations will study this moment as a case study in constitutional stress. They will ask whether senators behaved as custodians of a system larger than themselves or as tactical players protecting short-term interests. The answer will influence how much authority the Senate commands in future confrontations with executive power. Ultimately, this is about the survival of a principle older than any individual career, that no one is above the law. That principle is easy to endorse in theory and difficult to defend in practice. It demands courage precisely when consequences are most severe. It requires lawmakers to accept that preserving democracy sometimes means risking personal and political loss. As the proceedings continue, every statement, vote, and procedural maneuver will contribute to a record that cannot be erased. The nation is watching, even if not everyone fully understands the legal details. People sense when something fundamental is at stake. They recognize moments when the rules themselves are being tested. This is one of those moments. The outcome will determine whether the American experiment still functions as intended, with power constrained by law, or whether it is drifting toward a model where authority protects itself through partisan allegiance. The stakes could not be higher, and the consequences will not be confined to one presidency or one Senate term. When history looks back, it will not ask who won the immediate political battle. It will ask whether the Constitution still governed when it mattered most. The answer to that question is being written right now.